Imagine a perfect paradise, no pain, no fear, no death. But something happened. One choice changed everything. What if I told you that the story of Adam and Eve goes far beyond what you've been told? That behind the fall, there is a secret that still echoes through humanity, including in your own life? In this animation, you will see this story like never before, with shocking details, deep revelations, and an impact that may transform your view of good, evil, and the fate of humanity. Are you ready to uncover the hidden truth? Then get ready. The Garden of Eden, created by God, was a place like no other. Imagine a vast, lush landscape where the fresh air was scented with flowers, and fruit-bearing trees cast their welcoming shade. With every step, the gentle sound of water flowing through the rivers brought a sense of peace, and the ever-clear sky reflected a golden light that seemed to embrace everything around. It was a paradise of perfection and harmony, where nature existed in perfect balance with creation. At the center of this perfect place, God placed man, Adam, the first human being. He was formed from the dust of the earth, shaped by God's hands, and received a divine breath that gave him life. As he opened his eyes, Adam saw a vibrant world full of potential, yet something was still missing. Despite all the beauty around him, Adam felt a silent loneliness, for he was the only one of his kind in this vast and splendid garden. Everything was ready, but the companionship that God knew he needed was still absent. With his infinite wisdom and love, God looked upon Adam and said, "It is not good for man to be alone." He understood that Adam needed someone to share life with, to walk beside him, and to care for the garden together. So, God paused and, with his creative power, caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep. During that sleep, God took one of his ribs and, from it, created Eve, the woman, the perfect companion, made in the image of God but with a different nature, more delicate, filled with grace. When Adam awoke and saw Eve for the first time, he was amazed. She was everything he never knew he needed, but now he realized she was everything he had always dreamed of. They were destined to be one, complementing each other in a way that was wonderful and unparalleled. Their love was not just a feeling, it was a deep connection, a union of body and spirit, given by God. The Garden of Eden was now complete. The man and woman, created to live in perfect harmony with nature and with God, had everything good at their disposal. There was no pain, no suffering, no death. They walked with God, spoke with him, felt his presence, and knew they were safe. It was a world without conflict, where everything was abundant and good. The fruits were always ripe, the lush trees offered refreshing shade, and the rivers flowed with crystal-clear waters, inviting them to drink from the fullness of life. But God, in his infinite wisdom, wanted their choice to be genuine. Though the garden was a place of perfection, there was one special tree at its center, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God gave Adam and Eve free will, the ability to choose. He provided everything they needed to be happy but said, "You may eat from any tree in the garden, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat, for on the day you eat from it, you will surely die." This command was not a punishment but a protection. God wanted Adam and Eve to have the freedom to choose, to trust him, and to submit to his will. The tree was not just a test, it was also an opportunity for humanity to choose obedience, and with it, love. Paradise was ready, but despite all the beauty and harmony surrounding them, there was tension in the air. Adam and Eve's free will, their ability to choose between good and evil, was about to be tested. They lived in a perfect world, but the freedom to choose meant that nothing was guaranteed. The question lingering in the air was, how would they use this freedom? Would they trust God completely, or would curiosity and the desire for something more lead them to defy the only command given? Paradise was ready to be enjoyed, but the path to it was, in a way, also the path of decision. In the heart of the Garden of Eden, where everything seemed perfect and harmonious, God did something very important. He approached Adam and Eve, the first human beings, and gave them a clear and simple command, but one of great significance: "You may eat from any tree in the garden, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat." This command was not just an arbitrary rule. It was an instruction filled with meaning, a decision of love and trust. God had created a paradise for them, a garden full of delicious fruits, vibrant flowers, and peaceful animals. There was no hunger, no sorrow, and above all, no death. Adam and Eve had everything they needed, but there was one tree in the middle of the garden that God asked them not to touch. And this tree was unlike the others. It had a special name, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why, then, did God place this tree there? The answer lies not just in the tree itself but in the choice Adam and Eve would have to make. God had created them with free will, the ability to choose between right and wrong, obedience and disobedience. He wanted them to love and follow him, not because they had no choice, but because they chose to do so out of love and trust. The tree was a reminder that, even though the garden was perfect, true peace and love could only exist when there was the option to choose. This single command was not a punishment or something too difficult to understand. On the contrary, it was a gift, an opportunity to demonstrate faith, trust, and obedience to the Creator who had given them everything they could ever desire. They could eat from any tree in the garden except one, the tree that would bring them the knowledge of good and evil. God knew that the fruit of this tree would not bring blessings but suffering and irreversible consequences. He knew that humanity was not prepared to bear the weight of knowing evil. Imagine the scene: Adam and Eve, living in an environment of indescribable beauty, surrounded by abundance, with only one restriction: not to eat from this specific tree. It was a simple yet profound test. Would they fully trust in God's plan for their lives? Or would the temptation to want more than what they already had, the desire to know what was beyond, be stronger? God's command was clear. The choice was before them. They didn't need to fully understand the reason for this restriction, but they needed to trust. It was a test of their loyalty, an opportunity to express true faith. God did not just want obedience, He wanted a relationship of trust, where He was the leader and they were His faithful followers. In Eden, there was everything, except for one thing: the desire to control what was beyond their reach. And God knew that this temptation could be the key to their fall. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represented much more than just a forbidden fruit. It represented the desire to take something that was not given by God, to cross the boundaries He had established. And no matter how wonderful the garden was and how perfect life seemed, that single tree became the ultimate test of Adam and Eve's trust in their Creator. Would they respect the limit set by God? Or would they give in to the temptation of wanting more? Thus, in the heart of Eden, amidst the gently flowing river, the fragrant flowers, and the animals playing around, God issued a challenge of trust. What seemed like a simple command was, in fact, an opportunity for the first couple to prove their love for God and their ability to choose harmony with their Creator over the desire for something beyond their reach. And as Adam and Eve looked at the tree, surrounded by the abundance and perfection of the garden, they held in their hands the key to the future of humanity, the ability to fully trust in God or to reach for something He had reserved for another moment, in another plan. What would they choose? In the heart of the Garden of Eden, where everything seemed perfect and harmonious, God did something very important. He approached Adam and Eve, the first human beings, and gave them a clear and simple command, but one of great significance: you may eat from any tree in the garden, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat. This command was not just an arbitrary rule. It was an instruction filled with meaning, a decision of love and trust. God had created a paradise for them, a garden full of delicious fruits, vibrant flowers, and peaceful animals. There was no hunger, no sorrow, and above all, no death. Adam and Eve had everything they needed, but there was one tree in the middle of the garden that God asked them not to touch. And this tree was unlike the others. It had a special name: the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why, then, did God place this tree there? The answer lies not just in the tree itself but in the choice Adam and Eve would have to make. God had created them with free will, the ability to choose between right and wrong, obedience and disobedience. He wanted them to love and follow Him, not because they had no choice, but because they chose to do so out of love and trust. The tree was a reminder that, even though the garden was perfect, true peace and love could only exist when there was the option to choose. This single command was not a punishment or something too difficult to understand. On the contrary, it was a gift, an opportunity to demonstrate faith, trust, and obedience to the Creator who had given them everything they could ever desire. They could eat from any tree in the garden except one, the tree that would bring them the knowledge of good and evil. God knew that the fruit of this tree would not bring blessings but suffering and irreversible consequences. He knew that humanity was not prepared to bear the weight of knowing evil. Imagine the scene: Adam and Eve, living in an environment of indescribable beauty, surrounded by abundance, with only one restriction: not to eat from this specific tree. It was a simple yet profound test. Would they fully trust in God's plan for their lives? Or would the temptation to want more than what they already had, the desire to know what was beyond, be stronger? God's command was clear. The choice was before them. They didn't need to fully understand the reason for this restriction, but they needed to trust. It was a test of their loyalty, an opportunity to express true faith. God did not just want obedience, He wanted a relationship of trust, where He was the leader and they were His faithful followers. In Eden, there was everything, except for one thing: the desire to control what was beyond their reach. And God knew that this temptation could be the key to their fall. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represented much more than just a forbidden fruit. It represented the desire to take something that was not given by God, to cross the boundaries He had established. And no matter how wonderful the garden was and how perfect life seemed, that single tree became the ultimate test of Adam and Eve's trust in their Creator. Would they respect the limit set by God? Or would they give in to the temptation of wanting more? Thus, in the heart of Eden, amidst the gently flowing river, the fragrant flowers, and the animals playing around, God issued a challenge of trust. What seemed like a simple command was, in fact, an opportunity for the first couple to prove their love for God and their ability to choose harmony with their Creator over the desire for something beyond their reach. And as Adam and Eve looked at the tree, surrounded by the abundance and perfection of the garden, they held in their hands the key to the future of humanity, the ability to fully trust in God or to reach for something He had reserved for another moment, in another plan. What would they choose? Eve was alone, her eyes fixed on the forbidden tree. The glow of its fruit seemed to call to her in an irresistible way. She knew God's warning, "Do not eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." But at that moment, the serpent, cunning and persuasive, had planted a seed of doubt in her heart. The promise of something more, something beyond what God had given, echoed in her mind. She looked at the fruit closely. It was attractive, vibrant in color, and seemed to have a perfect texture, almost as if it had been made to be savored. It was good for food, which appealed to her physically. But there was something more, something that stirred her deepest desires. Eve saw that the fruit was pleasing to the eyes. It was as if that piece of creation had been designed to be desired, to make someone feel special, wiser, more powerful. Then, the serpent continued its persuasion. "Why does God not want you to eat from this tree?" it asked in a soft, hissing voice. "Because He knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like Him, knowing good and evil." That promise of wisdom, of deep understanding, was what truly struck Eve. She wanted to know more, to understand more, to be more. She already had everything in Eden, a place of infinite beauty, peace, and harmony. But somehow, something inside her felt that obedience to God had its limits. Maybe there was more, something God did not want her to have. The thought of becoming like God seduced her. After all, who doesn't want more control, more power over their own destiny? And so, with her heart full of doubts and desires, Eve made her decision. She reached out and took the fruit. Its touch was soft, and the weight of it in her hand felt significant. A step of faith, or rather, of disobedience, was about to be taken. She bit into the fruit. The taste was instantly sweet, sweeter than anything she had ever tasted. But as she savored the first bite, a feeling of emptiness began to take over her heart. It was a sweetness that could not be satisfied. She felt more aware, yes, but also more distant from God. Something in her being began to change. The temptation did not stop with her. Almost as if she already knew what she would do next, Eve went to Adam, who was nearby. She looked at him with a mixture of expectation and insecurity. Adam, her partner, her life companion, was as immersed in creation as she was. He trusted her, and she knew that. So she offered him the fruit, saying, "Eat, Adam. You also need to understand what I know now." Adam looked at the fruit and then at Eve. He knew God's command, he knew the restriction, but there was Eve, his great love, holding the key to something more. Something that God seemed to have kept for Himself. A doubt settled in Adam's mind. What would be worse, disobeying God's command or remaining unaware of what Eve had discovered? He could see in her eyes a certainty in something she now believed to be true. With a deep sigh and a decision made, Adam took the fruit. He looked at it for a moment, perhaps reflecting on the gravity of the choice he was about to make. And then, without further hesitation, he bit into the fruit. The moment he did, something changed. Something within him also transformed. He and Eve were no longer in harmony with God. They had broken trust, the divine covenant. Sin was not just an action, a bite of forbidden fruit. It was a conscious choice, a decision to trust the serpent's words more than what God had said. They chose to seek what seemed good to the eyes, what pleased their senses and desires, rather than trusting in what God had planned for them. And at that moment, Eden was no longer the same. Paradise had been stained. Innocence was lost. The path of the fall was set, and the consequences of that choice would echo through generations. Adam and Eve's disobedience was not just a momentary failure, it was the decision that opened the door to suffering and separation between man and God. By eating the fruit, they did not just disobey, they lost the perfection and purity with which they had been created. They were now on the path of knowing both good and evil, and with that knowledge came pain, suffering, and, most importantly, separation from harmony with the Creator. What seemed like a small choice led to the loss of everything that was pure and perfect. And the story of Adam and Eve began to unfold, forever marked by the decision that would change the destiny of all humanity. When Adam and Eve, driven by curiosity and the desire to know what God had forbidden them, finally ate from the forbidden fruit, something happened that changed everything. What seemed like a promise of wisdom and power, given by the serpent, was not what they had imagined. They had believed the serpent's words, that their eyes would be opened and they would become like God, knowing good and evil. But the truth was very different. The moment the fruit touched their lips and was consumed, a strange and bitter feeling overwhelmed them both. They did not become like God, as they had been seduced to believe. They did not feel divine power coursing through their veins, nor a new understanding that elevated them to a higher position. Instead, something dark enveloped them. Their eyes were opened, but what they saw was something entirely unexpected. Eve looked at Adam, and Adam looked at her, and for the first time, they realized something that had been invisible to them until that moment: the total vulnerability of their bodies. What had once seemed unimportant now became a source of great shame. They were naked. The purity of their existence, until that moment marked by harmony with God and the absence of guilt, was replaced by an overwhelming sense of discomfort. The body, which had once been just a natural part of their life in the garden, now became a source of embarrassment. Fear, which had previously been a distant and meaningless word to them, now took the place of the peace that reigned in Eden. Adam and Eve, who had once walked side by side with God, conversing with Him in communion, now felt an immense distance. It was as though, at that moment, paradise had transformed into a strange and threatening place. Guilt entered their hearts like a shadow, and with it came fear. The fear of God, the fear of themselves, the fear of the unknown. They had never felt this before. There had been no separation between them and God, but now there was an invisible barrier, a sense that something was irreparably broken. The perfect relationship that existed between the Creator and His creatures, a connection without guilt and without shame, was destroyed by a single choice. Innocence, that purity of spirit which characterizes the initial state of humanity, was lost at that moment. The total trust in God, the belief that everything He said was true, was replaced by doubt, disobedience, and the desire to attain something that had never been promised to them. What had once been Eden, the perfect garden of peace and harmony, now seemed like a cold, distant, and lonely place, a reflection of what was happening inside them. Paradise, now, was a place of guilt and fear, not because God had changed, but because they had changed. The reality of the consequence of sin became clear. And, even though the garden remained, with its fruit-bearing trees, its crystal-clear rivers, and the fresh air of creation, nothing seemed perfect anymore. The relationship between Adam and Eve, now stained by disobedience, also began to be affected. The trust between them, once as solid as a rock, was now wavering. They turned to each other, unsure of what to do with the shame that now enveloped them. What had once been natural, to see each other naked, was now a stigma, something that needed to be hidden. Instead of feeling freedom and harmony, the weight of guilt was unbearable. Their gaze toward one another was no longer pure, but marked by the awareness of their failure. The perfect paradise, once filled with God's presence, was now marked by His absence, because He, in His holiness, could not approach where sin was present. This was the beginning of a new reality for humankind, a reality where sin, shame, and fear are part of the journey. And it was at this very moment, when everything seemed lost, that the first sign of mercy began to appear. God, who knew what had happened, did not abandon Adam and Eve. The story does not end with the loss of paradise, but with the hope that, through a promise, something new could arise. But that is already part of a story that goes far beyond the fall, a story of redemption, which would begin to be written at that very instant of pain and repentance. After the moment of disobedience, everything changed. The sky, which had once seemed clear and welcoming, now appeared distant and silent. The harmony of Eden, which resonated with the sound of creation, was replaced by a heavy silence, as if even nature itself were in mourning. Adam and Eve, who had once walked with God every day, now found themselves alone, immersed in their guilt and shame. The pain of their disobedience was palpable, like a shadow stretching over them. They had broken God's trust. The paradise that had been given to them, the home of peace and perfection, was now only a distant memory, something that could never be recovered. They knew they had failed, and this left them unprotected, vulnerable. But God, in His immense and incomprehensible love, did not leave them alone in the darkness of their choice. He, who had always been with them, was now seeking them. He did not go to them with immediate words of condemnation. He did not confront them with anger or contempt. He called in a way only God could, with a deep, unsettling love that defied human understanding. "Where are you?" His voice echoed in the garden. Not a voice of accusation, but a voice of love. Not a voice confused about where they were physically, but a voice asking for the response of their hearts, asking for the relationship that had been broken. God knew exactly where they were, but He wanted to hear from them. He wanted them to admit the separation. He wanted them to reconnect with Him. The question was not a simple doubt. It was not that God had lost Adam and Eve in the vast garden. No. He knew them intimately, knew where they were and what they had done. The question was an opening. An opening for repentance, an opening for the pain of separation to be recognized, so the path to reconciliation could begin. It was an invitation to dialogue, an opportunity for the truth to be revealed and restoration to begin. But Adam and Eve were terrified. They were no longer used to God's presence as before. Before, walking with God had been an experience full of trust and intimacy. Now, fear consumed them. They hid among the trees of the garden, trying to escape from God, but how could they flee from His presence? Their hearts were full of fear and shame, and they did not have the courage to face God's loving gaze. "Where are you?" God repeated, with the same tenderness. He knew that the only way to heal the separation was by restoring the broken relationship. He would not abandon them, even though they had turned their backs on Him. The separation was not the end, but the beginning of a new path, a path of restoration and forgiveness. Adam finally came out of his hiding place. He knew what he had done, and his response was a mixture of guilt and repentance. "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." It was a moment of raw truth. Adam recognized that the reason for the fear was the shame he now carried. They were naked, not just physically, but spiritually. Sin had stripped them of their innocence, and now they were before God, exposed in their fragility. God, upon hearing these words, did not reject him. On the contrary, He sought a way to restore what had been lost. He did not leave them in the darkness, but in His mercy, He revealed that a solution would come. A redemption was promised, something that, though distant, would bring hope to all humanity. God, with His immense love, sought to restore the relationship that had been broken, and this pursuit would not stop until it was complete. This moment was a landmark in human history. It was not only the fall of Adam and Eve but the beginning of a plan of salvation that would span generations and culminate in Jesus Christ. When God said, "Where are you?" He was also saying, "I will find you, no matter what has happened." Our story does not end here. And so, in God's voice, there was no condemnation, but an offer of forgiveness and an invitation for the relationship to be restored. The story of Adam and Eve, far from being just a tragedy, is also a story of hope, of immeasurable love, and of a God who, in His grace, does not give up on His children, even when they stray. The silence hung over the garden. The untouched beauty of Eden was beginning to give way to the consequence of disobedience. Adam and Eve, ashamed, their heads bowed, awaited God's judgment. The serpent, in turn, remained there, motionless, as if savoring its apparent victory. But in that moment of darkness, something unexpected happened. God, the creator of all things, looked at the serpent and spoke words that would forever change the course of humanity. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Those words echoed in the air like a deep prophecy, a mystery that the serpent itself might not yet fully understand. But what was God saying there? He was declaring that, one day, from the woman's offspring, someone would come. Someone who would face the serpent, who would crush the head of the ancient serpent, destroying its power and breaking the curse of sin. The serpent, in that moment, believed it had won. With a subtle lie, it had managed to separate the man and the woman from God's presence. But this promise was a clear warning: its victory was temporary. A Redeemer would come. And when He came, He would bring redemption, restore what had been lost, and rescue humanity from the darkness. But what did "you will strike his heel" mean? God was already making it clear that this battle would come at a cost. The woman's descendant would suffer a blow, would be wounded, but this wound would not be his defeat. On the contrary, it would be through this suffering that he would bring the ultimate victory. Adam and Eve, even though feeling the weight of the punishment, heard those words with something they hadn't felt since eating the fruit: hope. They knew they had sinned, that pain and death were now a part of their lives. But God had not abandoned them. He was promising that, despite the fall, there was a path to restoration. The promise of the Redeemer was not only for that moment. It was a promise for all the generations to come. A reminder that evil would not have the final word. That one day, a descendant would be born, bring light to the darkness, and restore the communion between God and humanity. And so, in the midst of the curse, God gave birth to the first promise of salvation. A thread of hope was woven into history, and through the centuries, the children of Adam and Eve would await the fulfillment of this prophecy. A Savior would come. And when He came, He would bring the redemption the world so desperately needed. The silence weighed in the air. The Garden of Eden, once filled with harmony and life, now felt different. Adam and Eve felt a coldness in their souls that they had never experienced before. That place, once a home of peace and abundance, now seemed distant, as if they no longer belonged there. God's voice had echoed, bringing the sentence. It was not an explosion of fury, but a decision full of pain. The Creator, who once walked with them every afternoon, was now pronouncing words that would change the destiny of humanity forever. They needed to leave. Eve's eyes were teary. Her heart was pounding fast. She looked at Adam, seeking comfort in him, but all she found was the reflection of the same fear she felt. For the first time, fear and uncertainty were part of their lives. The divine order was clear. They could no longer stay there. Eden was a holy, pure place, and now, marked by sin, they no longer had the right to live in it. But there was something even more serious, the tree of life. If they ate its fruit now, they would remain eternally in their fallen condition, separated from God forever. This could not happen. Then, God made a drastic decision. At the entrance of the garden, an angel was placed to guard it. It was no ordinary angel. The celestial figure radiated intense light, and in its hands, a flaming sword spun in all directions, blocking any attempt to return. The way back to paradise was sealed. Adam felt the weight of reality fall on his shoulders. He, who was created to rule over all creation, would now be ruled by fatigue, sweat, and the pain of hard labor. The earth, which once offered fruit with ease, would now resist. He would have to plant, fight against thorns, wait for the rain, and even then, the harvest would not always be plentiful. Eve, in turn, now knew what suffering was. The curse upon her was clear, the pains of childbirth would be intense, and her heart would always carry the weight of her decision. But not only that. She and all the women who came after her would feel in their souls the struggle between dependence and the desire for control. Now, facing the unknown, they began to walk. The ground beneath their feet felt rougher than ever. The wind that once blew softly now seemed colder and indifferent. Paradise was behind them, and they could never return. But even in that moment of pain, God did not leave them completely helpless. He did something unexpected. Before casting them out, God himself made garments of skin to cover their nakedness. No longer leaves that dried and fell apart, but sturdy clothes, made by his hands. It was the first sacrifice. The first blood shed. A shadow of what would come much later, when another sacrifice would bring redemption to all of humanity. And so, Adam and Eve took their first steps out of the Garden of Eden. The world was now different. A world where sin reigned, where pain existed, where death was certain. But it was also a world where hope still shone. God had promised a Savior, and that promise would never fail. The wind blew strong that afternoon, stirring the leaves of the trees and carrying away the last traces of Adam and Eve's presence in the Garden of Eden. They had received their sentence. The paradise that had once been their home was now out of reach. The golden glow of Eden faded behind them as they walked into a world they had never known, a cold, harsh world where the earth would not easily yield its fruits, and where life would be marked by effort, pain, and eventually, death. But even in the midst of sadness and exile, God did not abandon them. Before they left the garden, he did something unexpected. He prepared clothes to cover their nakedness. But these clothes were not made of fragile leaves, like the ones they had tried to use to hide their shame. God sacrificed an animal and, with its skin, covered Adam and Eve. This act was more than a gesture of care, it was a profound symbol. For the first time in human history, blood was shed because of sin. That garment represented a truth that would echo throughout humanity: without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. Now, far from Eden, Adam and Eve faced a different reality. The soil, once fertile and generous, had become hard and required arduous labor to produce food. Childbirth, which should have been a moment of joy, would now be accompanied by pain and suffering. The world, which had once been governed by peace, was now subject to struggle, fear, and uncertainty. Yet, even so, God was present. He not only sustained them, but he also gave them a promise: from the woman's offspring would come the one who would crush the serpent's head. Over time, Adam and Eve had children. Cain and Abel were the first, but their story would soon demonstrate the weight of the fall. The sin that had entered the world now manifested in the generations that followed. The first murder in history occurred when Cain, filled with envy and jealousy, killed his own brother. Eve's heart broke to see that evil had now become part of humanity. Yet, God continued to fulfill his promise. With the birth of Seth, a new lineage began, and with it, hope was renewed. The years passed, and humanity multiplied. The world became a place filled with challenges, but God always raised up people who kept the promise of redemption alive. Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of them carried in their stories a glimpse of the divine promise. God had not forgotten his plan. With each generation, an invisible thread connected the events leading to the climactic moment of history, the birth of Jesus Christ. When Jesus came into the world, he was the definitive answer to the promise made in Eden. He was the descendant of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. His life, his death, and his resurrection were the fulfillment of what God had promised to Adam and Eve from the beginning. He not only restored the lost connection between God and humanity, but also opened the way to a new paradise, far greater than the first. The cycle of pain and suffering that began in Eden was broken. Now, through Christ, humanity could have a new beginning. Access to the tree of life, lost in the Garden of Eden, was restored in eternity with God. And thus, the story that began with a fall ends with redemption, showing that despite disobedience and separation, God never stopped loving and seeking humanity.